Okay, so this is the pre-lecture for ecosystem-based management, and I'm going to go through attributes of ecosystem-based management, something on the case for the partnership, the case for making conservation partnerships with private landowners, habitat conservation plans, and just a moment about natural community conservation planning, a state of California provision. So I'm going to start this with in 1996 when Norm Christensen chaired a committee of the Ecological Society of America with some fairly prominent people. You should recognize many of these names down that list. To report on the ecological basis or the scientific basis for ecosystem management. And in this paper, they identified key elements to ecosystem management. They think there are things like sustainability, establishing goals, using models, thinking about connectedness and the complexity of systems, dynamism, scale, humans, adaptability, and accountability of actions. They identified four precepts of ecosystem management: that scale is crucial, that there's a functional dependence of these systems, that they're dynamic, and that they're inherently uncertain. They also identified key obstacles that for managing ecosystems, and that knowledge will be insufficient, that data will be inadequate, that management will need to transcend ownership boundaries, and that public perception will likely dominate decisions. But they identified some key steps to recognize and embrace, and these were to identify sustainable goals, reconcile spatial and temporal scales, and make the system adaptable but accountable. This is a pretty forward-looking thing. There are a whole bunch of papers in this special feature that appeared in Ecological Applications, 20 articles. It took about 80 journal pages. Again, big names from all the, most of the agencies were represented. People talking about the budget and the Endangered Species Act. This was a really broad look at this issue, and that they identified several scientific principles, among them the Buzz Holling and the principle of surprise, that we should be expecting unexpected results, that we should use science as a model, that etc. And they had a variety of different protocols that were suggested. They mentioned that we could be organized and managing these systems at a variety of different socio-physical scales, from elements up through the human environment, and at various different physical scales. And so they had a diagram that looked like this, with things like the noosphere on it. And so if you look since then and look at ecosystem-based management, this is an ISI Web of Science search that I did a couple years ago, that you come up with something that looks a little bit different from what that vision was back in 1996. In that, of the 10 most cited articles, 7 of them are in the marine environment, and 2 are in social sciences, and 1's a generic paper. And so none of them are really from the terrestrial environment. The 10 most recent articles, 9 out of them were marine, and the other one was freshwater, again, not terrestrial. But if you look at the oldest articles, none of them were marine, and 6 out of the 10 were social science, governance, and policy, and 1 was about forestry. So it seems that the ecosystem management, and I think what Christensen and all defined as ecosystem management, continues to be a mixed thing, but ecosystem-based management seems to be a set of words that's almost uniformly constrained to aquatic environments, mostly marine aquatic environments. So Grumbine defined ecosystem management for conservation biology, so thinking specifically of conservation, and did this in 1994, and said you use a hierarchical context, that we need to understand ecological boundaries, and we have to pay attention to ecological integrity, and that this requires data collection and monitoring and adaptive management and interagency cooperation and organizational change to facilitate that interagency cooperation. And it recognizes humans as embedded in nature. This is not a particularly new concept, but it recognizes it is that humans express a dominant set of values, and that drives management in general. And so, what this mean for conservation? That Grumbine suggested that we should maintain viable populations of all native species in situ, that to represent within protected areas all those native ecosystem types across their natural range of variation. Maintain ecological and evolutionary processes. This includes disturbance regimes and hydrological processes and nutrient cycles. And then to think about the long view and manage and plan to manage over long periods of time. And that should also accommodate human use and occupancy. But of course, these were simpler times before we started thinking about climate change and how that might influence our capacity to protect all viable populations of native species in their historic ranges. And so, this was the vision. And of course, this holistic concept of ecosystems and management has taken on different forms and uses somewhat different language and different guises. So Rip Sparks in 1995 in a famous bioscience article identified this thing called the river continuum concept that was really initiated by Venot in 1980. But this basic idea that these ecosystems are connected top to bottom, and then in order to think about any particular point in the river ecosystem, you had to be thinking about the whole system. So again, that sort of movement towards larger scale thinking was replete in the mid 1990s there. So where did it all go? Carl Folk and others went on to think about adaptive governance and the role of institutions and organizations in moving this forward. Landris and others defined this concept called and formalized this concept of a historic range of variability to think about a benchmark for which you could try and manage things. So as biological systems, so we were trying to manage for these thresholds. And then Kai Lee and the compass, a really fantastic book that I think everyone should read is The Compass and the Gyroscope. It's now 15 years old now probably, but it was written about the Columbia River Basin and interagency cooperation and ecosystem management there. But basically case studies in interagency cooperation and why that fails. So this idea of historic range of variability, in some systems this is relatively easy. Forests, woodlands, places with long historical records where you can use tree rings, charcoal, fossil pollen, photos, early survey records and historical accounts to try and reconstruct what ecosystems looked like and how they functioned and what was the nature of their diversity. These are where we can identify historical range of variability and apply this to managing systems presently. But often that's not so readily available, and then we tend to use things like reference sites as being the best thing we have for thinking about what that historical target might be. But as I've mentioned earlier, that climate change threatens this idea of using historical range of variability as the concept towards which we're managing, as does the recognition of non-native species that we won't get rid of, and the idea of reconciliation ecology. So there was this in 2012. There was a report revisiting Leopold resource stewardship in the national parks, and moved on from the Starker-Leopold report of pristine pre-Columbian visages, and went on to say that we're looking for ecological integrity and authentic experiences and a sense of a transformative experience, a sense of wonder and awe in these places. And that may or may not include species from historical distributions. But on top of all that, there's information that came out like this. Now, this is NatureServe data up in the upper right. The red bars are listed species, and the blue bars are ones that they claim as imperiled. And this is just now dot distributions, occurrence data for where things are found and who owns the land. And so the fraction of species that are that are found somewhere on one of these types of lands. So that this is saying is that a little bit more than between 50 and 60% of both listed and imperiled species are found on somewhere on federal land. But if you look at private land, then that's 50% of imperiled, but the highest percentage of listed species, 65% of listed species have occurrences on private land. And so it really has highlighted this idea that has become widespread now, that we need to engage private landowners in the endeavor of conservation, or we just can't possibly succeed. And so so we have a number of things that come online. The private lands opportunity, the case for conservation incentives, something funded by the Doris Duke Charitable Fund and worked on by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And it really lays the case out for setting aside conservation easements, working with private landowners to do the business of conservation. And that alongside the Nature Conservancy, now the Fish and Wildlife Service is a major player with working with private landowners with no intent of owning that land. And, in contrast, Forest Service and BLM and others work with private landowners as neighbors and partners, and people who use those federal lands to do similar things to enhance conservation value. But so there's programs across the federal government in working with private landowners on conservation. And so the pros are that it's economical and socially acceptable, that it's difficult for the federal government to buy up a bunch of new land, and the shortcomings are permanence and effectiveness, that sometimes when land title changes, the next landowner isn't so interested in maintaining those conservation initiatives, or that economic times change, and the landowner's principal concern is economic viability, and that they change their management strategies, and so it can be less effective than something that has conservation or resource stewardship as a primary goal. But another major step forward has been these joint ventures, and there are many, many examples of joint ventures now. This is a screenshot from the Intermountain West joint venture, but some of them are joint ventures based on landscapes, like this Intermountain West one. Others are built on taxa. So if there's, for example, a number of bird joint ventures. But they involve the federal government, state governments, NGOs, tribes, philanthropic organizations, universities, and private landowners to partner together to try and create opportunities for conservation. So the federal government and the state governments often bring money to the table to help private landowners. Philanthropic organizations also bring money to the table to help private landowners and those agencies work together to achieve a joint vision of conservation goals. This brings us down to the last couple topics, and I'm going to stop this now, and I'm going to go. I just have a couple slides left, but I'm going to run over the 2 minutes I have left on this one, so I will end it and put it on a second YouTube.